What happens when someone who is obsessed with you becomes a killer? This is not a rhetorical query, nor is it merely a dramatic device. It is a chilling, tangible inquiry into the deepest, most terrifying recesses of human psychological distortion. It delves into the insidious process where an unwanted, relentless fixation on another individual transcends the bounds of mere infatuation, evolving instead into a dangerous, pervasive, and ultimately fatal force. The progression is one of calculated escalation, from an initial unwelcome gaze to a relentless, all-consuming pursuit, and tragically, in the most extreme and heartbreaking circumstances, to the irreversible act of taking a human life. This narrative aims to illuminate the unsettling reality of individuals consumed by an overwhelming, profoundly unhealthy fixation, meticulously tracing the insidious path where obsession twists into something monstrous, culminating in lethal violence. We will witness how personal boundaries are not merely breached but systematically obliterated, how sacred private spaces are not just violated but relentlessly invaded, and how, in the most extreme and tragic circumstances, a dangerous, pathological fixation metastasizes into an unyielding force that extinguishes human life. These are not isolated, inexplicable anomalies, but disturbing patterns of behavior that, when left unaddressed or underestimated, can lead to catastrophic, irreversible outcomes, leaving behind a vast and enduring trail of devastation, profound loss, and irreparable trauma for victims and their communities alike. The inherent tension in such progression is not a literary construct. It is a raw, terrifying truth born directly from the documented records of real-life tragedies, a testament to the dark potential residing within unchecked human psyche. This exploration will meticulously present multiple real-life instances where the relentless, suffocating pursuit of an individual tragically culminated in murder. Each case serves as a unique yet profoundly disturbing testament to the destructive, all-consuming power of unchecked obsession, meticulously revealing how an unyielding, pathological fixation can, with chilling inevitability, evolve into an act of fatal violence. We will begin our examination with the poignant and unsettling case of Sarah Miller, a vibrant, promising young professional living a seemingly ordinary life in quiet, unassuming suburbs of a Midwestern American city during the early 2000s. Her existence, meticulously cultivated around a burgeoning career, a close-knit circle of supportive friends, and a future brimming with optimistic normalcy, was abruptly and irrevocably intersected by the dark, spiraling path of an individual consumed by an unhealthy fixation on her. Her story is a stark reminder of how quickly the mundane can descend into the terrifying. Then, we turn our attention to the equally unsettling narrative of David Chun, a respected community leader and dedicated family man residing in a bustling coastal town during the late 1990s. His seemingly uneventful, well-ordered life was irrevocably altered by the unwelcome, relentless attention of an admirer whose initial overtures quickly soured into a terrifying, pervasive ordeal that consumed his every waking moment. Each individual victim highlighted in this series of true accounts, meticulously identified by their full name, their specific geographical location, and the precise time frame of their harrowing experience, represents not merely a statistic, but a vibrant life fundamentally changed, then tragically and unjustly cut short by the escalating terror of a stalker's relentless pursuit. These brief yet impactful introductions are designed to provide essential, compelling context, laying the groundwork for a deeper understanding of the profound human stakes involved in these chilling narratives. We will delve into the backgrounds of these victims, exploring aspects of their personal and professional lives, painting a picture of who they were before the insidious shadows of obsession began to encroach upon their existence. In some heartbreaking instances, the genesis of the stalker relationship was seemingly innocent, a fleeting social interaction, a casual acquaintance formed at work or through shared hobbies, or even a simple professional encounter that was profoundly misinterpreted or maliciously twisted by the perpetrator into something far more significant and personal than it ever was. For Sarah Miller, the initial, seemingly benign connection began innocently enough, a brief, unremarkable professional interaction at a local industry conference that her future stalker, in his warped perception, distorted into a deeply personal, almost fated bond. In David Chen's equally tragic case, the origin was even more tenuous and disproportionate. An unreturned gesture of kindness, a simple act of neighborly goodwill that ignited an intense, all-consuming and utterly disproportionate fixation in the mind as future tormentor. These initial points of contact, often perceived as benign, harmless, or even entirely innocuous by the victims, were, in retrospect, the fertile ground from which the malevolent seeds of obsession were sown. They established a fragile emotional foundation upon which the stalker would attempt to construct a delusional, one-sided relationship, gradually and insidiously escalating their unwanted attention until it became a pervasive, suffocating, and ultimately life-threatening presence in the victim's every waking moment. The subtle, often imperceptible origins of these obsessions underscore a critical, terrifying aspect of stalking behavior: its insidious ability to emerge from seemingly ordinary, everyday interactions, gradually evolving in intensity and malice until it consumes the victim's entire sense of safety, autonomy, and psychological well-being. These cases serve as a stark, unsettling reminder of the inherent vulnerability present in daily life, where a casual encounter, a polite smile, or a simple act of courtesy can, in the distorted and pathological mind of a disturbed individual, be catastrophically reinterpreted as a profound connection or an invitation, leading to a relentless, suffocating, and ultimately lethal pursuit that tragically threatens and then extinguishes an innocent life. The chilling reality presented is that the journey from initial obsession to murder is often a gradual, terrifying descent, obscured by the very normalcy that the stalker so cunningly exploits. The initial points of contact, seemingly benign or even forgettable to the victims, mark the true genesis of a sinister pattern, the origin of obsession. For the individuals who would become stalkers, these encounters were not casual interactions, but profound, often delusional, moments that ignited an intense, all-consuming fixation. They misinterpreted polite smiles, professional courtesies, or a simple act of kindness as overtures of deep connection, an invitation into a relationship that existed solely within their distorted perceptions. This marked the chilling beginning of a psychological trajectory that would rapidly spiral out of control, moving from private fantasy to aggressive, public pursuit. The earliest signs of this burgeoning fixation often manifested as unwanted advances, subtle at first, then increasingly persistent. These could be seemingly innocuous gestures that, in isolation, might be dismissed as awkwardness or an overly enthusiastic attempt at friendship. Perhaps it was an unexpected compliment delivered with an unsettling intensity, or an uncomfortably prolonged gaze in a public setting. For Sarah Miller, it began with a barrage of highly personal emails following their brief professional interaction, messages that quickly transitioned from work-related topics to highly intimate inquiries about her personal life and emotional state. The language was overly familiar, bordering on presumptuous, despite their minimal acquaintance. These early communications were not reciprocated, yet the stalker persisted, undeterred by the clear lack of interest. For David Chun, his initial discomfort arose in the sheer volume of unsolicited gifts that began appearing on his doorstep: meticulously crafted baked goods, personalized trinkets, and handwritten notes that expressed an overwhelming admiration far beyond the scope of their brief, casual acquaintance. These were not offerings of genuine friendship, but declarations of ownership, designed to compel a response and establish a unilateral connection. As the obsession deepened, the methods of contact intensified, becoming less about polite interaction and more about pervasive presence. Intense messages became a daily occurrence, flooding victims' inboxes and voicemails. These messages often contained highly personal details about the victim's routine, observations that indicated close surveillance, or declarations of love and devotion that were utterly unreciprocated and terrifying in their intensity. The content shifted from adoration to a disturbing possessiveness, sometimes tinged with anger when their advances were ignored. Voicemails would consist of long monologues, detailing the stalker's day, expressing their love, or subtly hinting at their proximity. This relentless digital assault served to erode the victim's sense of privacy and safety, making their own devices feel like instruments of surveillance rather than communication. Beyond the digital realm, the stalkers began to manifest their presence physically. Repeated appearances in the victim's daily life became a chilling norm. This could involve showing up unexpectedly at their workplace, waiting outside their home, or appearing at social events they knew the victim would attend. These were not coincidental encounters, but deliberate acts of surveillance, designed to establish a constant, inescapable presence. For Sarah Miller, Her stalker began appearing at her regular coffee shop, then outside her gym, his presence always just at the periphery of her vision, a phantom shadow that grew increasingly corporeal. David Chin reported seeing his stalker parked on a street for hours, or following his car home from errands. This constant physical proximity created an escalating sense of dread, transforming once safe public spaces into arenas of potential encounter. The victims began to feel like characters in a play written and directed by their stalker, their lives no longer their own. What might have initially been dismissed as harmless infatuation or awkward romantic overtures quickly escalated, building a pervasive atmosphere of unease and foreboding. The seemingly harmless behavior began to take on a sinister edge, revealing the true depth of the stalker's pathology. Late-night calls, often silent or accompanied by heavy breathing, shattered the peace of night, eroding the victim's ability to rest and compounding their anxiety. These calls were not seeking conversation. They were asserting control, a demonstration of the stalker's ability to invade even the most private moments. The act of lurking, standing conspicuously or subtly watching from a distance, became a constant feature of the victims' lives. This could be observed from their windows and rear-view mirrors, or by friends who noticed an unfamiliar car or figure consistently present. The feeling of being constantly watched, of having every movement observed, created a pervasive sense of paranoia, turning familiar environments into unsettling landscapes of surveillance. Then came the unequivocal act of following. This involved tracking the victim's movements, either on foot or by car, mirroring their daily routines. For Sarah Miller, it meant her stalker was suddenly turning up at restaurants she frequented with friends, or appearing outside stores she shopped at, always just close enough to be seen. David Chin experienced a chilling realization that his stalker knew his children's school schedule and his wife's work hours, indicating a level of detailed surveillance that moved beyond casual observation into deliberate tracking. This relentless pursuit transformed daily commutes and routine errands into terrifying expeditions, robbing the victims of their freedom of movement and their fundamental right to privacy. The cumulative effect of these escalating behaviors was a profound erosion of the victim's sense of personal autonomy and safety, creating a chilling atmosphere where the boundary between their private life and the stalker's obsessive world became increasingly porous. The victims were trapped in a tightening web of unwanted attention, witnessing firsthand how seemingly harmless fixations could, with chilling inevitability, twist into a relentless, suffocating, and deeply terrifying pursuit. The seeds of obsession, once subtly planted, had begun to sprout into a menacing, ever-present threat. The initial stages of obsession, marked by unwanted messages, gifts, and subtle appearances, had laid a groundwork of unease. Yet, this was merely the prelude. As the stalker's fixation deepened, and their efforts to establish control were consistently rebuffed, the nature of their behavior shifted from pervasive presence to outright menace. The harmless facade began to crumble, revealing a darker, more aggressive intent. This marked the critical phase of escalation, where the obsession unequivocally turned threatening, transforming the victims' lives into a waking nightmare of increasing fear and vulnerability. The communications intensified, their content morphing from obsessive declarations into overt harassment. Messages and calls, once merely persistent, now became filled with anger, veiled threats, or explicit demands. For Sarah Miller, the tone of the emails changed dramatically. What began as pleading morphed into accusations of cruelty and manipulation, then spiraled into disturbing threats of exposure and public shaming. Her stalker detailed scenarios of ruining her career and reputation, painting her as a deceitful individual. Phone calls, once silent or filled with heavy breathing, now include aggressive verbal abuse, often delivered in a low, menacing tone, outlining how her life would be made unbearable. He would call her workplace, posing as a client, then subtly weaving in personal details gleaned from his surveillance, a clear violation of her professional boundaries. David Chun faced a similar onslaught, with his stalker leaving hateful messages on his answering machine, accusing him of perceived slights and expressing intense resentment. These messages sometimes contained chillingly specific threats against his property or his loved ones, delivered with a chilling certainty that indicated a loss of rational control. This relentless barrage of hostile communication was designed to isolate the victims, to wear down their psychological defenses, and to instill a profound sense of fear that permeated every moment of their day. Beyond the verbal and digital assaults, the harassment escalated into tangible acts of aggression. Vandalism became a common tactic, a clear demonstration of the stalker's proximity and their willingness to cross physical boundaries. For Sarah Miller, her car tires were slashed repeatedly, forcing her to constantly check her vehicle before leaving her home. Her apartment door was defaced with crude, threatening messages, visible to neighbors in a stark, public declaration of the ongoing terror she faced. She discovered her mail tampered with, her packages opened, and sometimes bizarre, disturbing items left on her doorstep. David Chen's property also became a target. His garden, a source of pride, was systematically destroyed. Windows on his home were broken and unsettling. Anonymous letters were left in his mailbox, not only containing threats, but also displaying intimate knowledge of his family's routines. These acts of destruction were not random. They were calculated violations designed to send a clear message. The stalker was always present, always watching, and capable of inflicting real harm. The vandalism served to erode the victim's sense of security in their own homes, turning their sanctuaries into places of constant anxiety. The escalating nature of the threats moved beyond property to direct challenges to the victim's physical safety. There were clear violence attempts, often narrowly averted, but leaving an indelible mark of terror. Sarah Miller recounted an incident where she was followed closely by a car matching her stalker's vehicle, forced to swerve violently to avoid being run off the road. She began to notice figures lurking in the shadows near her apartment building at night, fleeting glimpses that instilled a pervasive sense of dread. One evening, as she returned home, she heard a strange noise inside her apartment, only to find signs of forced entry, a terrifying indication that her physical space had been violated while she was away. For David Chun, the attempts were even more direct. He reported objects thrown at his house late at night, shattering windows and creating a pervasive sense of being under siege. On one occasion, he narrowly avoided being struck by a vehicle that swerved directly into his path while he was walking in his neighborhood, an incident he initially dismissed as an accident until similar patterns emerged. These incidents, whether direct or implied, cause victims to live in a constant state of hypervigilance, their lives dictated by the omnipresent threat of an unseen aggressor. The cumulative effect of this escalating terror was immense, leading profound emotional fear that permeated every aspect of victims' lives. They experienced chronic anxiety, sleep deprivation, and a pervasive sense of dread. Their personal relationships suffered as they became withdrawn and fearful, often reluctant to socialize or venture out alone. The constant threat eroded their ability to function normally, impacting their work, their health, and their overall well-being. They lived in a state of perpetual hyper-awareness. Every unexpected sound, every unfamiliar car, every glance from a stranger becoming a potential sign of their tormentor's presence. Sarah Miller installed multiple locks on her doors, drew her blinds constantly, and avoided going out after dark. David Chin began varying his daily routes, always looking over his shoulder, transforming his once peaceful routines into tactical maneuvers to avoid detection. This pervasive fear consumed their thoughts, coloring their perception of the world and stripping away their sense of safety and autonomy. They were prisoners in their own lives, their freedom curtailed not by bars, but by the invisible, suffocating chains of a stalker's relentless, escalating aggression. The line between obsession and direct threat had been decisively crossed, leaving the victims with an overwhelming realization that their lives were in grave, undeniable danger. As the stalker's behavior escalated from mere presence to overt threats and acts of vandalism, the victims' fear solidified into a desperate need for effective intervention. They recognized the acute danger and sought help from various sources, believing that their pleas for protection would be met with understanding and decisive action. Yet tragically, their increasingly frantic attempts to secure safety were often met with dismissal, underestimation, or insufficient responses, leaving them in a terrifying state of growing helplessness. The immediate instinct for many victims was to go to the police. Sarah Miller, her car tires repeatedly slashed and her apartment door defaced, compiled a detailed log of every disturbing incident. She documented the dates, times, and specifics of unwanted messages, suspicious sightings, and acts of vandalism. With this meticulously gathered evidence, she presented her case to local law enforcement, hoping for immediate protection and the apprehension of her tormentor. David Chun, whose property had been damaged and whose family felt increasingly vulnerable, also provided comprehensive accounts of the harassment, detailing the threats and the chilling surveillance. They shared their fears, emphasizing the escalating nature of the stalker's behavior and their profound sense of being under siege. However, the initial response from some authorities was often disheartening. Stalking at the time was frequently misunderstood or not fully recognized as a serious, life-threatening crime. Victims were sometimes advised that without direct physical violence or explicit, undeniable threats of harm, their options were limited. Cases were often categorized as harassment rather than the more severe stalking, which carried different legal implications and protective measures. The legal framework surrounding stalking was still evolving, and the gravity of persistent, non-physical psychological terror was not always immediately grasped. While officers filed reports and sometimes made attempts to contact the alleged stalkers, these actions often did little to deter the relentless perpetrators, who saw such limited police intervention as further proof of their impunity. The victims' appeals for formal restraining orders or protective measures were sometimes met with bureaucratic hurdles, requiring an accumulation of evidence that was often difficult to obtain without placing themselves in further danger. Beyond law enforcement, victims also took personal measures to enhance their physical security. They installed security systems, adding deadbolts to their doors, reinforcing windows, and placing security cameras at strategic points around their properties. Sarah Miller, her sense of safety in her own home completely eroded, invested heavily in a sophisticated alarm system, a futile attempt to reclaim a semblance of peace. David Chun had motion sensor lights installed, hoping to deter the lurker he frequently spotted near his house. These physical deterrents, while providing a fleeting sense of control, often proved inadequate against a determined and resourceful stalker. The very act of fortifying their homes underscored their increasing isolation and fear, turning their sanctuaries into fortresses against an unseen enemy. Each new lock, each new camera, was a silent acknowledgement of the pervasive threat. Furthermore, victims sought to enlist the support of their personal networks. They warned friends, family members, and colleagues about the stalker's existence and their escalating behavior. Sarah Miller confided in her closest friends, explaining the terrifying reality she was living and urging them to be vigilant. David Chin informed his colleagues at work and the parents of his children's friends, hoping that a wider awareness would deter his tormentor or provide additional eyes to spot suspicious activity. These warnings, while crucial for creating a support system, were often met with well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful advice or a lack of full comprehension of the danger. Friends might dismiss a behavior as just infatuation or a harmless crush gone wrong, underestimating profound psychological distress and physical threat the victims faced. The true insidious nature of stalking, its slow burn from admiration to malevolence, was difficult for outsiders to grasp, particularly when the stalker often presented a plausible, even charming, facade to others. The victims' increasingly desperate pleas for help were sometimes met with discomfort or a subtle suggestion that they might be overreacting, further isolating them and undermining their confidence in their own perceptions of danger. The narration from this period often captures a profound helplessness experienced by the victims, articulated through phrases like, "They told him it was just infatuation," or, "The police said they couldn't act until there was real violence." This dismissal, whether from law enforcement or well-meaning acquaintances, created a harrowing vacuum of support, leaving the victims feeling profoundly alone and vulnerable. They were caught in a bureaucratic and societal blind spot, where the invisible chains of psychological terror were not given the same weight as overt physical assault. The inadequacy of the response mechanisms meant that the victims were essentially left to fend for themselves against an escalating, unseen threat. Their efforts to gain protection were continuously dismissed or underestimated, leading to a tragic failure in preventing the ultimate escalation. This lack of effective intervention allowed the stalker's obsessions to fester unchecked, emboldening them and driving them further down a dangerous path. The victims, already terrified, became increasingly disillusioned with the systems designed to protect them, watching as their stalker's actions grew bolder, more direct, and undeniably more dangerous, inching relentlessly toward a terrifying, irreversible climax. The stage was set for a tragedy that could have been prevented had their cries for help been truly heard and acted upon with the urgency and seriousness they deserved. The cumulative effect of dismissed appeals, underestimated threats, and a pervasive sense of helplessness had created an unbearable pressure cooker in the victims' lives. The stalker's escalating behavior, coupled with the systemic failures to provide adequate protection, pushed the situations towards an inevitable, tragic breaking point. The subtle psychological torment that had defined the preceding phase now gave way to overt aggression. This marked a triggering event, a major confrontation, or an outright act of violence that shattered any remaining illusion of safety and plunged the victims into a horrifying reality. This was the moment when obsession irrevocably crossed a line into physical assault or, tragically, homicide. For Sarah Miller, the situation reached its devastating climax after months of escalating harassment, including vandalism and narrowly averted physical threats. Her stalker, enraged by her continued refusal to acknowledge his delusional advances, decided to breach her final sanctuary, her home. The break-in occurred late one evening. Sarah had meticulously secured her apartment, reinforcing locks and installing an alarm system, but the stalker's determination had grown to a terrifying level. He bypassed her security measures, forcing entry into her personal space. The sound of forced entry, a terrifying intrusion into the quiet of her evening, was the last sound she consciously registered before confronting her tormentor. The ensuing confrontation was brief but brutal, a direct physical assault that was a culmination of months of psychological terror. She fought desperately, but the stalker, fueled by a distorted sense of rejection and a pathological need for control, overpowered her. The scene that followed was one of unspeakable violence, a desperate struggle for survival against an assailant who had become unhinged. The privacy of her home, once her refuge, became the scene of her ultimate terror. David Chen's case culminated in an equally horrific but distinct manner, following a prolonged period of intense harassment and thinly veiled threats against his family. His stalker, frustrated by David's consistent attempts to ignore and distance himself, escalated from property damage to a direct physical attack in a public place. This was not a random act of violence. It was a premeditated ambush. David was ambushed as he left his office late one evening, a routine he believed was safe due to its public nature. The attack was swift and vicious, intended to inflict severe harm and send an undeniable message of the stalker's power and rage. David, caught completely off guard, sustained serious injuries during the assault, narrowly escaping with his life thanks to the unexpected intervention of a passerby. This incident, while not fatal, served as an agonizing premonition of the stalker's ultimate intent, confirming that the perpetrator was willing to cross any line. The attack underscored a failure of previous protective measures and left David and his family living in a state of extreme terror, knowing that the next encounter might be fatal. Tragically, for other victims in the broader pattern of stalker-to-killer cases, the triggering event was the most devastating outcome imaginable: homicide. The culmination of the escalating obsession and the repeated failures of intervention led directly to the taking of a life. In one such case, a young woman, constantly stalked by a former acquaintance, was murdered in her own driveway despite having filed multiple police reports. Her appeals for a restraining order had been denied due to insufficient direct threats, a bureaucratic oversight that cost her life. In another, a man pursued by a former colleague was fatally stabbed in a public park, an act of cold-blooded murder committed in broad daylight, ending years of fear and escalating confrontations. These homicides were not impulsive acts, but often the tragic, final steps in a long, documented progression of escalating harassment and violence. The stalker, feeling rejected, empowered by perceived impunity, or driven by a final, desperate attempt to control, took the irreversible step. The victims, already living in a state of terror, were tragically unable to escape the relentless pursuit that had become their every waking nightmare. The visuals accompanying these events intensified dramatically, designed to convey the raw, visceral impact of these life-altering moments. Reenactments are used to meticulously recreate the scenes of forced entry, the desperate struggles, and the sudden, violent ambushes. These aren't sensationalized portrayals, but carefully constructed depictions based on police reports, forensic evidence, and victim statements, aiming for accuracy and impact without gratuitous detail. Police footage from the immediate aftermath of the incidents, showing officers arriving at chaotic or secure crime scenes, provides a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the reality of these events. Crime scene imagery, often blurred or strategically framed to respect privacy, offers a stark, chilling testament to the violence that occurred. The urgency of these moments is amplified by the sheer finality of the actions, underscoring the irreversible consequences of the stalker's escalating violence. The shift in visual and narrative tone reflects the dramatic crossing of a critical threshold, where psychological terror translates into tangible, life-threatening harm. The victim's worst fears, often dismissed or underestimated by others, had tragically materialized, leaving behind shattered lives and irrefutable proof of a stalker's lethal intent. The tragic culmination of the stalker's escalating violence, whether through a brutal assault or catastrophically homicide, immediately initiated a new, intense phase, the investigation and capture. When a long-feared attack finally occurred, law enforcement was no longer dealing with a harassment complaint or a vague threat. They were confronting a tangible crime, often with a clear victim and a documented history of predatory behavior. This shift in gravity galvanized police efforts, transforming the preceding, sometimes underestimated, reports into critical pieces of a now urgent puzzle. The immediate priority became securing the crime scene, providing aid to the victim if they survived, and initiating a swift, targeted hunt for the perpetrator. Detectives moved with precision, immediately focusing on gathering evidence. The initial, sometimes fragmented, reports of stalking and harassment, which had previously been filed without leading to decisive action, now became invaluable historical context. Police meticulously revisited these earlier complaints, cross-referencing them with the details of the present crime. Forensic teams swarmed the scene, collecting every possible clue: fingerprints, DNA samples, weapon remnants, and any physical trace that could link the perpetrator to the act. Concurrently, a critical part of the investigation involved delving into the digital realm. Phone logs were immediately subpoenaed, allowing investigators to trace the stalker's relentless calls and messages, establishing patterns of contact and geographic locations. Surveillance footage from public cameras, private security systems, or even doorbell cameras in the vicinity of the crime was systematically collected and analyzed. This often provided chilling visual confirmation of the stalker's presence, their movements leading up to and away from the attack, and sometimes even clear identification. Crucially, testimonies from neighbors, friends, and family who had been previously warned about the stalker became vital. Their accounts corroborated the victim's earlier complaints, painting a clear picture of the escalating menace and reinforcing the perpetrator's long-standing pattern of obsessive behavior. These witnesses, who might have initially dismissed the behavior, now offered invaluable insights into the stalker's personality, habits, and movements. The tactics employed to track and apprehend the killer were comprehensive and multifaceted. Detectives worked tirelessly to trace calls and messages, analyzing call detail records and IP addresses to pinpoint the perpetrator's location and communication patterns. They meticulously matched messages and emails found on the victim's devices or retrieved from service providers to the suspect's known digital identities, further solidifying the link. Physical evidence, from DNA extracted from under the victim's fingernails to shoe prints left at the scene, was processed and compared against known databases and eventually against the suspect's own samples. This meticulous scientific and digital groundwork gradually tightened the net around the perpetrator. Once the overwhelming weight of the evidence pointed undeniably to one individual, the killer was identified and arrested. This apprehension often occurred quietly, a sudden, decisive act that ended the long reign of terror. For the victims' families, this arrest, though profoundly somber, offered a first true glimmer of hope for accountability and justice after an unbearable ordeal. The arrest was merely the beginning of a journey toward official accountability. The aftermath involved a complex and lengthy process of legal outcomes. The stalker, now definitively identified as the perpetrator, faced grave charges, including murder, attempted murder, aggravated assault, and multiple counts related to stalking and harassment. The trials were often intense, emotionally charged proceedings, with a full, horrifying narrative of obsession and violence was laid bare for the courts. Prosecutors presented a meticulously gathered evidence, compelling victim testimonies, where survivors bravely recounted their terrifying experiences, expert forensic analyses detailing DNA matches and digital footprints, and a comprehensive timeline of the stalker's escalating threats and actions. The evidence was often overwhelming, leading to swift convictions. The courts, recognizing the extreme gravity of the crimes and profound, lasting harm inflicted, delivered convictions of the stalkers turned killers. The sentences were often lengthy, involving decades or even life in prison, ensuring that these individuals would no longer pose a threat to society. For the victims who survived, and for the families of those who tragically lost their lives, the legal outcome brought a complex mix of emotions. There was an undeniable sense of closure, the knowledge that the perpetrator was held accountable and could no longer inflict harm. However, this closure was deeply tempered by the enduring reality of their trauma. Victims and survivors began the arduous, lifelong process of healing, often grappled with profound emotional and psychological scars. They reflected on the horrifying journey they had endured, the subtle signs they saw, the escalating fear, and the agonizing realization that their cries for help had often been dismissed. Many shared their trauma in therapy, through support groups, and sometimes publicly, hoping their experiences could serve as a warning to others. The consequences for the perpetrator were clear: prison sentences, a complete loss of freedom, and a life forever defined by their heinous crimes. For the victims, however, the consequences were the lifelong emotional scars of living through a nightmare, the constant vigilance that forever alters their sense of safety, and the enduring grief for what was lost. The narrative concludes with a profound closing reflection, a critical summary of the lessons learned, and a powerful call to action. The story underlines a key warning: obsession can escalate. What may appear as harmless infatuation can, in the mind of a disturbed individual, fester and mutate into a dangerous, life-threatening fixation. This progression is rarely sudden. It is typically a gradual, insidious climb from unwanted attention to outright violence. Therefore, the narrative emphasizes the vital importance of taking stalking seriously from its earliest manifestations. It challenges a common misconception that stalking is merely a nuisance or an unfortunate romantic pursuit, highlighting instead its classification as a serious crime with potentially lethal outcomes. The final message is a clear, urgent cautionary takeaway. By paying attention early, lives can be saved. This statement is not merely a piece of advice. It is a directive for individuals, communities, and legal systems. It implores everyone to recognize the early warning signs of obsessive behavior, to understand the trajectory of escalation, and to ensure that victims' pleas for help are heard, validated, and acted upon with the urgency and seriousness they deserve. The significance of preserving evidence, supporting victims, and relentlessly pursuing justice is paramount. The journey from the earliest unwanted message to a devastating crime is a path paved with missed opportunities and underestimated threats. By learning from these tragic cases, by fostering greater awareness, and by strengthening protective measures, society can strive to prevent future tragedies, ensuring that the stories of those lost obsessions serve as a powerful catalyst for change and a lasting testament to the critical need for vigilance and early intervention.
Thank you for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more.